In this lesson, we're going to learn how to use our front-end Svelte application to call back-end endpoints and fetch some data. So a common use case in web apps is a user navigates to a route in the app. The component for that route needs data from a server. So the component will show a loading spinner icon to let the user know that something is happening. Then the component triggers a network call to the server to fetch the data. And when the data returns, the loading spinner is hidden and the user interface is updated with the data. So there's a lot going on in those steps, but Svelte makes it pretty easy to dynamically update the UI with the spinner icons and the data just through reactivity. And then we'll also use a library called Axios that makes HTTP network calls in JavaScript and makes that part a little easier. So we're going to start just by displaying a simple list that will hard code in the front end. So we're going to work in lunch menu admin.svelte. So open up that file and then we'll put in this simple list, lunch week list, and we're just going to hard code a couple values in there. And then we'll use our mustache brackets or curly brackets to just display that list. And this is kind of just a review of state and reactivity. So here's my lunch week admin component, and you can see that it's showing test 1 and test 2. So it's showing the two values from my array there. Now let's go one step further. The onMount lifecycle function is a good place for a component to initialize itself. And this is a good spot to do something like fetching data from a server. So we're going to add onMount in here. And then we'll set the lunch week variable to an empty array. And then in the onMount function, we'll actually set it to a value. Now eventually, in a minute, we're going to fetch this down from a server, but we're getting there piece by piece. So let's add the onMount lifecycle function there. And then we're going to say onMount async. And then inside there, we'll actually set the lunch week list. But we need to initialize it first. So let's move this up here. Okay. So now when the component's ready and onMounted, we'll actually set that list to a value. So give that a try. And you can see with the hot loading, that's updated there. So the onMount lifecycle function's working. The Axios library gives us a pretty convenient syntax to fetch data from an API. So we import Axios, and then we can call Axios get, and then we put the API route, and then the response from that call will contain the JSON from the REST API. So in this case, we say response.data, and that will contain the JSON. Okay, so that looks pretty easy, but there's a lot going on there, and there's some complexity lurking under the covers. And one important concept with the above code is the usage of async await syntax. So we've got the async keyword before our function signature, and then that allows us to await asynchronous calls. And you may have heard of promises. This is a modern way of dealing with promises. And so what async await does in this case is that it blocks until this call is finished before moving on to the next line of code. So here's an example of some similar code but without the await keyword. So what would happen if we set up our code this way is the Axios get call would fire, and that would run in the background, and then immediately the JavaScript runtime would console log response, which would be empty because it won't block, it won't wait until this call is finished. So you got to be careful and make sure when dealing with asynchronous network calls to use the await keyword. So let's go ahead and install Axios. in the front end project. So I'm going to stop the front end dev environment, npm install Axios, and then start it up again. Okay. And then let's go ahead and import it, and we'll use it to fetch from our API. So import Axios here, and then we're going to assign response.data to our lunch week list variable. Since we're dealing with a network call and something that's going over a network to a server, this could have a failure point in it. So it's a good idea to wrap this with a try catch. That way we can deal with errors more gracefully. So for example, we might want to show our users an error message that says error fetching data from server or something like that. So we'll add a try catch to it as well. For now, we'll just console log the error if we get one. Okay. So let's give this a try. Cool. So now go look at the network tab, and you'll see that we got a 200 OK status. And if you click on this and go to preview, you can see the JSON that was returned from the server. Now when we bound that list to Svelte, it just shows it as object. So it's not going to directly show a list of objects on the screen. I'll show you one more technique you can use if you do want to see the contents of those objects and have Svelte render it onto the web page. So back in our Svelte file, inside the curly braces, we can run any JavaScript we want. So we could run json.stringify and stringify that list. And when we do that, Svelte will render it onto the page so we can actually see the contents of those lists.
If you want to keep learning about how to build real-world apps with the latest technologies and other career-related topics, then start right now by subscribing to our channel and liking this video.